All right, everybody, thanks for making it to the Zoom show. It is my distinct pleasure today to welcome Dr. Deepti Singh to give our seminar. Deepti got her bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Vishwakarma Institute of Technology in Pune, India. She got her master's in aeronautics and astronomics engineering at Purdue University. And then she ended up getting her PhD in environmental earth system sciences at Stanford University, which is where I intersected with her. She went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Lamont Doherty at Columbia, and is now an assistant professor at Washington State University in Vancouver, which is the US Vancouver, not the Canada Vancouver. So in terms of what Deepti works on, she is primarily interested in the physical drivers of extreme climatic events and their intersection with all sorts of things. So agriculture, human health, water resources, all sorts of human impacting phenomena. Deepti is a Kavli Fellow from the National Academy of Science. And at present, she's also working on the National Climate Assessment, which is kind of like the IPCC report, but at the US government level. And specifically, she's working on the chapter on climate trends. And I believe some of the research she presents today is from that report. So we're getting a little bit of a sneak peek on the National Climate Assessment, which is exciting. And with that, Deepti, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Dan. I always cringe at the when people talk about my past degrees because they're so kind of irrelevant to what I do now, but hopefully shape it in some way. Yeah, always people always ask me, how did you switch from aeronautics to what you're doing now? Which is not a conversation to have right now. Can you see my screen? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I'm just gonna move some of these windows here. Okay, so yeah, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I have been wanting to come out to Northwestern for almost a year now, and I'm unfortunately not there in person, but I'm excited to meet some of you later today virtually, and at least this way we can see each other's faces. We're not masked. So today I want to talk about some of the research I've been doing on climate extremes that are relevant to public health hazards. So these are some of the images that I've. Sorry, can I get started?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry, I thought someone said something. Yeah, so these are some images of extreme events that I'm going to talk about. So I'll spare the details for later. You know, and Dan told me that many of you are geologists, so you probably don't spend as much time looking at these graphs. So this is a figure from the latest IPCC report that shows global average trends, global average temperature, and shows that the Earth has warmed by about 1.1 degrees since the 1850s. And if we look at the longer climate records, this warming is somewhat unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. And this is what the latest IPCC report concluded. So the main way in which we experience the impact of this changing climate is through extreme weather events. These are just some of the 4 examples of recent extreme weather events across the US, from heat waves in the Northwest to Hurricane Harvey, the fires in California, and to winter storms in the eastern US, where these events have had really substantial impacts on people, on infrastructure, on agriculture, on public health. they are, as you can see from the numbers mentioned here, these are all really costly disasters. They have each one of these events has resulted in losses exceeding 1 billion. So these are considered billion-dollar weather disasters. And what was surprising here in the Northwest is we had this heat wave last year, which you all probably heard about because it did make the news. And despite being in one of the most developed countries in the world, with all the resources that we have here, over 1,400 people lost their lives during this heat waves. So these events have just shown us how vulnerable our society is to the types of extreme events we are currently experiencing. So, in 2021, there were close to $20 billion weather disasters, and these occur pretty much across the US. And from heat and fires in the Western US to severe flooding to hurricanes and thunderstorms in the central and eastern US. There are different types of events that are happening, and a record of this since the 1980s has shown that these billion-dollar weather disasters are becoming more frequent. So that's not only happening because the climate is changing, it's happening because climate change is, so the impact of an extreme event depends on where these events are occurring and the underlying systems that are in those places. So, so the impact of an extreme event depends on, of course, the physical hazard, but is also a function of vulnerability, exposure, and response to those events. And all of these factors are factors that go into the increasing frequency of billion-dollar weather disasters, because now we have more people and we have more systems in these places. But what climate change is doing is pushing, is increasing the physical hazards that affect our society. And that's where my research is really focused. And many of these extreme events, as I mentioned in the title, have an impact on human health in a number of ways. And so this figure from the CDC report shows the different types of extreme events that are happening and the different types of health impacts that are associated with them, from air pollution to impacts on water quality to impacts of heat stress and impacts on food supply. So there are numerous ways in which these extreme events are can affect our health and are already affecting our health. And I'm going to talk about my research on the physical hazards of climate change in two different domains here. I'm going to talk about first talk about extreme heat, and then the second the research I'm going to share is on air pollution. And so, as I mentioned, here the risk of an extreme event is determined by both the hazard that's occurring as well as the response to the hazard that the society has, right? And one of the things that we have seen in the last few years is just multiple hazards occurring both in individual regions as well as multiple regions simultaneously experiencing extreme weather events. For example, this is an image from 2020, from when we had the fires in the Western US. And, pretty much like we had fires pretty much across the coastal states, from Washington, Oregon, California. And typically, these regions tend to share their resources, right? But the fact that there were so many extreme events, so many fires happening across this region, it really did affect the ability of these states to respond to those fires. There was generally, because there's like shared resources between these regions, when there is like an active fire season in California, for example, they can borrow resources, firefighting resources from neighboring states. But that was a situation that was not, this was not great for that. And in addition to the fires in the West, the simultaneous co-occurring fires in the West, there was also a hurricane hitting the Southeast simultaneously. And this really affected national emergency disaster management resources. And the fact that we have that society is kind of being hit by multiple extreme events simultaneously is really compounding the impacts that these individual events have. And so my research has really been focused on compounding hazards. That is either the occurrence of multiple extreme events in the same region, or the occurrence of multiple extreme events in connected regions at the same time. And when I mean connected, I mean they're physically connected by some sort of atmospheric or climate drivers, but also in terms of the systems that they affect. For example, these kind of widespread extreme events that we've had in the Western US have affected energy infrastructure here. Because if we had like an isolated incident, we would probably be able to handle those events individually. But when there are multiple events happening, that can really affect our ability to respond to these events. So I'm going to talk about two what I refer to as emerging hazards. These are not new in any way, but they are becoming a much larger concern, either globally or here in the US. And the first one is co-occurring heat and humidity. And these are results from a paper that was published at the end of 2021. And then the second paper I'm going to talk about is the co-occurring air pollutant extremes, which was actually done with a postdoc in Dan's group. So we know that climate change is resulting in warmer temperatures, and the consequence of those warmer temperatures are more extreme heat events, right? This is a very kind of simple, straightforward first order impact of climate change. We're seeing more extreme heat events, and these extreme heat events are some of the deadliest disasters that we have in the US. But heat, then an example of this from close to where you are is the Chicago heat wave in 1995 that resulted in over 700 heat-related deaths. Most of the people that were affected were either poor, elderly people, or communities of color. This was not like, in terms of temperature, it wasn't like a record-breaking heat event. The temperatures on July 13 during the peak of the event were about 106 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot. We're here in the Northwest, we're recovering from getting over 100-degree temperatures last summer. So I mean that it's hot, but it's not like the hottest temperatures that have occurred in the region. And the Chicago heat wave, they were during like the 5 or 6 day span of the event, temperatures only a couple of days were about 105 to 106 degrees, but for the rest of the event, they were closer to 90 degrees. However, the wet bulb temperature was extremely high, and wet bulb temperatures are essentially a measure of both temperature and humidity. And wet bulb temperatures during the event were approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which corresponds to about 29 degrees Celsius. And this really emphasized the fact that heat and humidity is not a good combination. Heat and humidity, the combination of heat and humidity is deadly. Prolonged exposure to humid heat temperatures, to wet bulb temperatures above 28 degrees have already been associated with reductions in labor productivity, reductions in increases in conflict, in premature, prolonged exposure to these, and by prolonged, I mean just a few hours exposure to these temperatures can result in death without any kind of external cooling. And this is one of the kind of main events here in the Western US that, in the US that emphasizes the impact of this combination of heat and humidity. But motivated by the impact that these humid heat events have had across the world, and a lot of research that has shown that humid heat is likely to increase in the future, we set out to try to understand how humid heat events, like what is the pattern of humid heat events, like what's the climatology of these events across the world, and also how have these events changed in the observed record. And so this is a figure from, this is a figure that's showing the temperature of the top 5% of hottest temperatures. And this is humid heat. So this is measured by wet bulb temperature, which again is the combination, it's a measure of temperature and humidity. And what we see here is that, like, there's some regions, like I've emphasized with the boxes here, where these temperatures are already exceeding that the threshold I mentioned, which is like 28 degrees. So any of the red, darker red colors indicate areas where humid heat, these wet bulb temperatures, exceed 28 degrees on at least some of the days that have already occurred. And these are regions where humid heat is a major risk. And if you also notice, these are many of these regions are densely populated regions in the world. These are areas where humid heat is already reaching thresholds that are considered dangerous for human health. And the reason we look at humid heat is because the pattern of the spatial, like the climatology of humid heat is different than the climatology of dry heat, which is just measured by temperature alone. So here, just to give you an idea of how these differ, I'm showing you dry bulb temperature, which is just basically air temperature that we get on our phones. And then on the right side is wet bulb temperature, which is the same figure that I was showing you previously. And I've just emphasized a couple of regions where dry heat and humid heat show very distinct differences. I mean, clearly we can see in the in the US, for example, the Western US doesn't really, because it's so dry, does not typically have high humid heat temperatures. But the Eastern US is kind of a hotspot for these humid heat temperatures, even though it doesn't get as hot as some other regions in the US. And then if we focus on West and Central Asia, we can see that there's certain areas that again are both of these. I mean, they're both hot and they're both humid, but we can see that there's some pretty substantial differences in the regions that are affected by these two hazards. For example, in the Persian Gulf, we see these, like the dry heat is obviously a concern there, but in some of the regions that we see here, humid heat has actually reached the threshold of like 32 to 35 degrees, which is considered like the limit of human survivability. And here, for example, if you look at India, we see some of the highest wet bulb temperatures in this Indo-Gangetic basin here that I'm pointing to. And this is one of the most agriculturally intensive regions in Asia, as well as in the world. Even though temperatures don't get as, like, they're hot, but they're not terrible. It's a combination of temperature and humidity that is the major heat hazard in this region. And so we've looked at how the frequency of extreme humid heat temperatures, extreme humid heat has changed since 1979, which is the start of this data set. And this map shows the increase in the number of days in a year that exceed this. Sorry, it's the frequency of extreme humid heat days in a year. And the dots indicate areas where the historical trends are not significant. So areas where that are highlighted in the boxes and where there are no dots are areas where the observed trends are significant. And so I've just highlighted a few of the key regions here where there are some, pretty regionally homogeneous trends, significant trends across these regions. And, one of the things that is important to notice here is that these extreme humid heat events are becoming more frequent in areas that are as I showed you on the previous figure, are areas where these humid heat temperatures are already a pretty significant risk to human health, because they're already reaching these critical thresholds that are considered dangerous for people. And so what we did is then quantified the change in exposure of people across the world to both dry heat and humid heat. And what we found is that the exposure to humid heat is actually higher, increasing at a faster rate than the exposure to dry heat. And so this figure here shows millions of people exposed per heat day. This is in red is for dry heat, and in blue is for humid heat. And it's especially in the last few years, we've seen that the exposure to humid heat is much higher than the exposure to dry heat. And that's primarily because these humid heat events are increasing in places where that are extremely densely populated. And just to note that in our calculations here, we assumed that population hasn't changed, which obviously it has over this period, but we were just trying to quantify changes in exposure, in population exposure to the specific hazards. And so the differences we see here are primarily because of differences in where these events are occurring and how their frequency is increasing. One of the other factors that is really important when we think about extreme events is when these events are occurring. And so we also found that in certain regions, typically in most of the world, dry heat and humid heat events occur at the same time. But in certain regions, we see that the timing of these events differ, of humid heat events differ from dry heat events. And these figures here show the month of the year when that had the highest number of extreme events. So for example, typically we get most of the extreme events, most of the hot events in July, the peak month with extreme temperatures in most of the US. But I want to draw your attention, to South Asia, which is where we see some substantial differences in the timing of dry heat and humid heat. For example, the hottest temperatures in the region occur in May or June in most of South Asia, but the hottest humid heat temperatures actually occur in July, or in some places in August. And so there's almost a 2 to 3 month difference in the timing of these two different events, which is again why we need to study these two types of heat-related hazards differently. And my work currently is looking at how the occurrence of these humid heat events intersects with agricultural activities in the region, as well as in other agricultural regions, because one of the main threats of humid heat exposure is to people that are involved in labor-intensive outdoor activities. And so I don't have results for that yet, but just anecdotally, I'm from India. I do some of my research in India as well, and I mean, I can attest to the fact that, like, the main summer season there is actually in May, unlike what we get here, which is the hottest temperatures which we get in July. And that is because it's hottest in May, but then in June, once the monsoons set in, that's when there's a lot of humidity that is brought to the region by the monsoons, and that's why we tend to see these higher humid heat temperatures in the middle of the monsoon season, which is our typical summer season. And that is actually when it has the highest impacts, because that is when most of the agricultural activities are happening. That's when most of the agricultural laborers are on the field doing really labor-intensive tasks. And so hopefully, we're working on this right now. One of my undergraduate students is looking at how changes in humid heat exposure is intersecting with the most labor-intensive parts of some of the labor-intensive crops around the world. And so I don't have results for that yet, but yeah. So are there any questions? Maybe I'll pause here for a second just to see if there are any questions. Okay, if not, I can keep going. I can save your questions till the end. So I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about the second type of hazard, which is the co-occurring air pollutant extremes that I mentioned. And this is work that's being led by my graduate student, Dmitry Kalashnikov, and Jordan Schnell was the postdoc on who was in Dan Horton's group. And he was very generously gave us a lot of data that we used for this research. And so this work is focused more on the Western US. And the reason that we're working on this issue is because overall we tend to think of air quality or air pollution as being different from climate change, but climate change can affect our air quality through affecting temperatures, through affecting weather patterns that also affect our air quality, and it can also affect the concentration of various air pollutants. And so two of the most well-studied, well-observed air pollutants are ground-level ozone and particulate matter across the US. We have, somewhat good measurements for these two pollutants for at least a couple of decades. And, overall, ozone and particulate matter have both been, the concentration of both these pollutants has been declining. And that's a good thing. We've, because of the Clean Air Act, overall, we've seen a decline in both these air pollutants. However, in the last few years, with the really, word for it, active wildfire seasons that we've had here in the Western US, some of these trends are these declining overall improving trends are reversing. And that's why it is becoming, again, a very active area of research. And so these pollutants are important because they have a range of health impacts. They can have impacts on cardiovascular health. They can affect our respiratory system. They can also affect developmental harm and cause developmental harm and contribute to premature mortality. And both these, if we're, just being exposed to one of these pollutants, that's bad enough. And what we're seeing recently is high levels of both particulate matter and ozone pollution occurring simultaneously. And the few studies that have been done that look at the impact of these co-occurring air pollutants actually suggest that their overall health impacts are compounding. So that means that the impact of having being exposed to multiple air pollutants simultaneously is worse than the sum of the individual exposures. And just to give you a sense of how important air pollution is, globally, nearly 4.2 million premature deaths are linked to exposure to outdoor air pollution. So air pollution is a big concern, and it is, of course, there are independent sources to air pollution, but climate change is affecting our exposure as well as some of the sources of air pollution. So I'm going to bring us back to these images that I showed you, that I showed on my title slide. These are like real images from 2020. I don't know if any of you lived or were in the Western US at the time, but this is like images from like middle of the day. This is from San Francisco. This is from the image on the bottom is from the Oregon coast, and we had skies like this for like at least a week from what I remember. And this, the figure on the right here is showing you the air quality index, which, the scale at the bottom shows you that, basically any colors that are in red or purple are conditions that are like air quality conditions that are harmful to most people. And pretty much the entire Western, like the Western coastal states were covered in air quality, in smoke, and air quality that was causing the air quality index to be kind of higher than it's been, I think, ever. And by ever I mean like for over the period for which we have data. And it was also higher than like the most polluted cities in the world. I had a global map of this as well that showed that the air quality index in parts of California and parts of Oregon were worse than Beijing and even Delhi. So those were really, pretty difficult times. And what our research has shown is that we are seeing an increase in the co-occurrence of particulate matter and ozone extremes across much of the US that's associated with these increasing wildfire activities. And so that's what I'm going to show you next. So this figure basically shows us the frequency, the trends in the frequency of co-occurrences of particulate matter and ozone. Actually, I should step back for a second and mention that, in the eastern US, y'all are more likely to get surface ozone and particulate matter at the same time. And that's, I think, the research that Jordan Schnell had done had shown that in the summertime in the eastern US, you get particulate matter, you get ozone, and you get heat. So you have multiple co-occurring hazards there. In the Western US, we're somewhat lucky that our particulate matter pollution is actually typically highest in the winter time, whereas ozone is highest in the summertime. But we are seeing an increasing trend in the co-occurrence of these air pollutants pretty much across the Western US. So all the areas that in this figure, this is opposite to what I was showing earlier. In this figure, all the dots indicate areas that show significant trends. So you can see that most, pretty much every part of the Western US is experiencing an increase in the frequency of particulate matter and ozone. We're also seeing that the spatial extent of the Western US that is affected by these co-occurring extremes is increasing. On the left side here is showing the fraction of grid cells that are simultaneously experiencing both extremes in particulate matter and ozone. And the reason the spatial extent is important is because in the Western US, there was nowhere you could go to escape those conditions. Like you could drive 100 miles and you still would not be in a place where you had some respite from those from all the smoke and the air pollutants that were associated with that. And close to 68% of the Western US in 2020 was affected by these harmful, simultaneously by these harmful air pollutants. And the population exposure associated with this with the increasing frequency of these extremes is also increasing. So here I'm showing you the person days. That's essentially a cumulative measure of the number of people exposed and the number of days that they were exposed. And this is, I mean, it's pretty non-linear, right? For like pretty much until 2015, we were seeing some exposure, but really since 2015, since the really active fire seasons of 2017, 2018, and 2020, we have seen almost a tripling in the exposure, the number of people exposed, exposed to harmful air pollutants. We're also seeing that these widespread co-occurring extremes are becoming more frequent and more persistent. And so when I say widespread, we're specifically talking about the number of days where the simultaneous extent of the Western US affected exceeds 25%. And the number of days with these kind of co-occurring extremes is becoming more frequent. And again, this, both the frequency as well as the persistence, that's the number of consecutive days with widespread extreme events. Both of these are increasing. Again, they're kind of non-linear. And you can see that the impact of the most recent fire seasons was, again, what's really driving the trend here. We kind of looked at, how, like, yes, we're talking about extreme events here, but like how extreme was it, right? And so these are absolute concentrations of particulate matter and ozone during these widespread events. So each of these dots represents the average concentration of these air pollutants across the Western US. And what we're seeing, the dashed lines indicate the EPA standards for the safe standards. So for particulate matter, that's about 35 micrograms per meter cube. And for ozone, that's about 70 parts per billion. And ozone, you can see this kind of overall declining trend because of the Clean Air Act, and because generally we have, cleaner vehicles, cleaner sources of energy. But with particulate matter, we're really seeing many of these days with average with average concentrations of particulate matter exceeding this EPA threshold. And this is, again, I'm trying to emphasize the average here because this is literally average across the entire Western US, which means that certain areas, individual like locations in the Western US were probably experiencing concentrations that were much higher than this. And so this is just to give you a sense of like, how severe these air pollutant, the concentrations were. And so one of the factors that we looked at is the meteorological conditions that are associated with these sort of widespread co-occurring extreme events. And of course, meteorological conditions are really important because, yes, we have fires, but the prevailing meteorological conditions determine where these pollutants are going to be carried. In fact, there was an image from New York showing the Statue of Liberty covered in smoke from this particular event. And so, the winds can carry some of these air pollutants to remote locations. And really are kind of the main factor that affects the extent of the region that's exposed. And so these figures here are basically the typical types of weather patterns that you see in the Western US. The weather patterns in red are referred to as atmospheric ridging patterns. Weather patterns in blue, where there's like a lot of blue, those are regions of low pressure, anomalously low pressure, and so they're troughing patterns. So basically, atmospheric ridging patterns are represented by these red colors here, and these three specific types of patterns that occur, they have occurred in the past, are the ones that are primarily associated with these harmful, these kind of widespread harmful air quality episodes. And what our research has shown is that the frequency of these atmospheric ridging patterns, which are basically regions of anomalously high pressure, are becoming more frequent. We've seen an increase in the frequency of these types of weather patterns that are conducive to both transporting air pollution to like sort of spreading the air pollution over a large region, but also causing accumulation and persistence of these air pollutants. We also looked at kind of the effect of both the extent of region exposed by, sorry, I think I'm just going to check what time it is. Dan, what time, how much time do I have left?
You have about 7 minutes left.
7 minutes? Okay. Okay, I don't have too many more results, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. We obviously the source of air pollution here was fires, right? And all the dots that are indicated on this map are locations of what are considered large fires. And each of these like lines here represents areas where there was smoke from the wildfires present. And the dots, the colors, the shading here are areas where there were the number, it's the number of days where there were co-occurring air pollutants. So you can see, if you just focus on like the contours, where the contours show the largest, where the contours are present, these are where there's smoke, there's also these co-occurring air pollutants. So obviously smoke from these fires are one of the main causes of the air pollution, the widespread air pollution that we see. And this was, I'm just showing you this for like one episode, the August 2020 episode, when there was the kind of most widespread, I think it was one of the most like active fire seasons, and it had the most area burned, and also the largest episode of these co-occurring air pollutants that we saw. But in addition to fires, we also saw that much of the Western US was experiencing record heat. So really, if you just focus on the red colors on this, what you can see is that most of the Western US was experiencing the highest temperatures. These are ranks of temperature. And so basically all the areas that are in dark red are areas that were experiencing record high temperatures during this episode. And so we actually looked at, we've kind of quantified how much both fire as well as temperature influence the co-occurrence, the region affected, as well as the severity of these harmful air quality episodes. And we find that both these factors are correlated. And so it's both the fire as well as the heat that is influencing the extent of region exposed, as well as the frequency of these episodes. And so to give you a quick summary of the talk, in case you missed it. So what I've shown is that changing climatic conditions are increasing the risk of co-occurring hot and humid conditions. They are also increasing the frequency and extent of co-occurring harmful air pollutant extremes. These are the two types of co-occurring compounding hazards that I've talked about today. There are lots of other examples of these kind of events that we are seeing. Um, and these kind of co-occurring events have a major impact on society. We've seen that in the last few years. We have examples of that from pretty much around the world. Some of the people that are most exposed to these hazards are outdoor workers, people that have to work in both the extreme hot conditions as well as conditions with really bad air quality. These are examples from both the heat wave in the eastern in the Northwest, and from farm workers working during the harmful air quality episode that I just talked about. Also, firefighters who are like on the front lines of these hazards are kind of bearing the brunt of these extreme events, these changing extreme events. And in addition, there are also just outdoor workers, people in the construction industry, in addition to agricultural workers that are disproportionately exposed to these kind of events, to these extreme events. And when we think about adapting to or minimizing our vulnerability to these increasing extreme events, these are the like a policy should be targeting how to reduce the vulnerability of these communities. And in addition to the impacts that we see on these communities, often our ability, our response to extreme events is also affects who is vulnerable, and our capacity to help those people. And often it's people that are from low-income neighborhoods, and people from communities of color that are often disproportionately affected by the hazard, as well as have limited ability to respond to cope with these events. So with that, I think I've shared what I had, and I'm happy to take any questions about any of this.